This is a serious matter. I understand. What do we do? We must be discreet. Tell no one. And the consequences?
There are photographs that capture joy, photographs that preserve memory, and photographs that hold secrets too heavy for paper and ink to bear. This is the story of one such image. A portrait taken more than a century ago that should have faded into obscurity, filed away in some dusty archive, forgotten by time and irrelevant to history. But it did not fade. It endured. And the reason it endured is precisely the reason it should never have been taken at all. The photograph measures roughly 8 inches by 10, printed on thick cardboard stock common to the late 19th century. The edges are worn, the corners softened by decades of handling. The sepia tone has deepened with age, giving the entire image a burnished, almost dreamlike quality, as though viewed through amber glass. 2 young men sit side by side in what appears to be a photographer's studio. Behind them, a painted backdrop depicts a pastoral scene. Rolling hills, a distant tree line, the kind of idealized landscape that studio photographers use to suggest prosperity and peace. The floor beneath them is wooden, polished to a dull sheen. A small table sits to their right, draped in dark fabric, upon which rests nothing of note. The young men themselves appear unremarkable at first glance. Both are dressed in dark wool suits, high-collared shirts buttoned to the throat, neckties knotted with care. Their hair is parted neatly, pomaded into place. One of them has a narrow face, sharp cheekbones, eyes that seem to stare directly through the lens and into some distant point beyond. The other is softer in feature, rounder in the jaw, with a faint trace of what might be a smile, or perhaps just the awkward tension of holding a pose too long. They sit close together, shoulders nearly touching, hands resting in their laps. Friends, perhaps. Brothers, possibly. Companions captured in a moment of stillness, preserved for posterity. But it is their hands that change everything. At first, the eye does not register it. The brain, seeking familiarity, accepts the image as it appears, a simple studio portrait, the kind taken by the thousands in that era. Young men documented their friendships this way. They sat for photographs to mark milestones, to send images home to distant families, to prove they had arrived in the world as men of standing. There is nothing overtly wrong with the composition. Nothing that screams danger or demands attention. And yet, when the photograph is examined more closely, when the image is magnified and the details brought into sharper focus, something begins to emerge from the shadows between their fingers. It is small but unmistakable. It rests in their hands, not one hand, but both sets of hands, held together as though they are jointly presenting it, jointly claiming ownership. The object is dark, metallic, compact. The shape is deliberate, engineered. It is not a book. It is not a watch or a keepsake. It is not a trinket or a token of affection. It is something else entirely. Something that does not belong in the soft, controlled environment of a portrait studio. Something that changes the meaning of the photograph from a celebration of friendship into something far more unsettling. The photographer who discovered this image in a Pennsylvania estate sale did not notice it at first. She bought the photograph for $1, drawn to the quality of the print and the haunting intensity of the subject's faces. It was only later, at home, under the bright light of a desk lamp, that she saw it. She posted the image online, asking if anyone could identify the studio or the year. Within hours, dozens of people had responded, not with answers but with questions. What are they holding? Why are they holding it together? And most disturbingly, why does it look like they wanted it to be seen? Because that is the most chilling detail of all. The object is not hidden. It is not tucked away, partially obscured by shadow or angle. It is positioned carefully, deliberately between them. Their hands are arranged around it with a kind of reverence, or perhaps pride. They are not ashamed of it. They are not concealing it. They are displaying it. And the photographer, whoever set up this shot, whoever adjusted the lighting and framed the composition, allowed it, encouraged it even, which means this was not an accident. This was not a mistake. This photograph was meant to exist exactly as it does. And that raises a question that cannot be ignored. What were these 2 young men trying to say? What message were they sending through time, coded in sepia and shadow, waiting for someone to look closely enough to understand. The image has no name, no date stamped on the back, no inscription to explain its purpose. It is anonymous, orphaned from context, adrift in history. But it is not meaningless. It is anything but meaningless. Because once you see what they are holding, you cannot unsee it. Once you understand what it represents, the photograph transforms from a curiosity into a confession. And so the investigation begins, not with certainty, but with a single unsettling realization. This photograph should not exist, but it does. And somewhere in the faded ink and aging cardboard lies a truth that someone, over a century ago, wanted preserved. Whether as a boast, a warning, or a memorial, we may never fully know. But we can trace the threads. We can follow the clues. We can ask the questions that no one thought to ask when the shutter clicked and the image was born. Who were these two young men? Where was this photograph taken? And what exactly are they holding in their hands? The answers, as it turns out, are far darker than anyone could have imagined. Every photograph is a puzzle, and every puzzle has edges, points of reference that allow the picture to be reconstructed. In the case of this particular image, the edges were faint, but they were there, hidden in the margins, embedded in the details, waiting to be decoded by those willing to look. The first clue came from the cardboard backing itself. Mounted photographs of this type were standard practice in the late 1800s and early 1900s, particularly in professional studios. The photographer would expose the glass plate negative, develop the print, and then mount it onto a sturdy card, often embossed with the studio's name and location. In this case, the embossing had worn away almost entirely, but under magnification, a few letters remained visible along the bottom edge. An ornate script, barely legible, but enough to suggest a name, something ending in Field and Sons. A search through historical archives of American photography studios yielded several possibilities, but one stood out: Winfield and Sons, a portrait studio that operated in central Pennsylvania between 1887 and 1911. The studio was known for its quality work, catering to middle-class families and young professionals. Its records, remarkably, had been preserved in part, donated to a local historical society after the business closed. Among those records were ledgers listing the names of clients, dates of sittings, and occasionally, notes on the type of portrait ordered. It took weeks of cross-referencing, but eventually, a match was found. In the autumn of 1903, two names appeared in the ledger on the same day, listed under the same appointment time: Thomas Alden Cruz and James Milton Hargrove. The notation beside their names read simply, "Dual portrait, standard pose, one print. Thomas and James." Two young men, both 22 years old according to census records. Both unmarried. Both residing in the same boarding house in the town of Minersville, a small coal mining community nestled in the hills of Schuylkill County. The census described Thomas as a clerk, James as a laborer in the mines. They were listed in the same household, though not as family. The term used was boarders, but the closeness of their lives suggested something more. Shared meals, shared rooms, shared routines. In that era, such arrangements were common, born of economic necessity rather than choice. But the bonds formed in those cramped quarters were often deeper than blood. Further research into their backgrounds painted a picture of two lives running parallel, intersecting by chance and circumstance. Thomas had been born in Ohio, the son of a schoolteacher and a shopkeeper. He had moved east in his late teens, seeking work in the booming coal towns of Pennsylvania. James, by contrast, was local, born in a neighboring township, the youngest of 6 children, most of whom had either died young or scattered to other states. The mines were his inheritance, his destiny, the only employment available to a young man with no formal education and no prospects beyond the dark tunnels beneath the earth. Yet despite their different origins, they had found each other. The records suggest they met in 1901, shortly after Thomas arrived in Minersville. By 1903, they were inseparable. Witnesses from that time, fragments of letters, entries in church registries, mentions in local newspapers, describe them as a unit. The two young men who board at Mrs. Keller's house. Thomas Cruz and his companion, James Hargrove. There is a tenderness in the language, a recognition of something unspoken but understood. And then there is the photograph itself. Commissioned, paid for, taken deliberately. In 1903, having a portrait made was not a casual expense. For working men like Thomas and James, it represented a significant outlay of money, perhaps a week's wages or more. People did not sit for photographs lightly. They did so to mark occasions, weddings, graduations, departures, or, in rare cases, to commemorate something that could not be spoken aloud but needed to be remembered. The studio ledger offers no explanation for why they chose that day, that moment, to be photographed together. There is no annotation indicating a special event or celebration. Just the appointment, the names, and the brief description of the service rendered. But the timing is significant. The photograph was taken in late September of 1903, just as the leaves were beginning to turn and the first chill of autumn crept into the Pennsylvania hills. 2 weeks later, something happened that would shatter the quiet rhythm of their lives and cast a shadow over the image that would never fully lift. But before that event can be understood, the photograph itself must be examined more closely. Because while the ledger provides names and a date, it does not explain the object in their hands. It does not account for the expression in their eyes, calm, almost serene, but undercut by something harder, something colder. It does not explain why the photographer allowed them to pose with it, or why no one in the years since has been able to identify the photograph's true purpose. The names were a starting point, the studio a location, but the real mystery lay not in who they were, or even when the photograph was taken. The mystery lay in why. Why did Thomas and James, two young men with modest means and unremarkable lives, choose to immortalize themselves in this particular way? What did they want the world to see? And what were they willing to risk by putting it on display? The answers, as the investigation would soon reveal, were buried not in the photograph itself, but in the silence that followed its creation. A silence so complete, so deliberate, that it could only have been born from fear or guilt. There is a language spoken by the body that words cannot capture. It is the language of tension and release, of muscle memory and instinct. It is visible in the angle of a shoulder, the curl of a finger, the slight shift of weight from one foot to another. Forensic analysts and behavioral experts have long understood this. A person can lie with their mouth, but the body rarely lies. And in the case of Thomas and James, their bodies were telling a story that their faces tried desperately to conceal. The photograph, when subjected to modern forensic image analysis, revealed details that would have gone unnoticed by the casual observer in 1903. A researcher specializing in historical crime scene photography was brought in to examine the image under controlled lighting and magnification. Her name was Dr. Elena Voss, a professor of criminology with a particular interest in how visual evidence is constructed and interpreted. She had examined hundreds of archival photographs, many of them depicting criminals, victims, and witnesses from an era when photography was still considered an objective, almost magical form of truth-telling. She knew how to read the invisible text written in posture and expression. Her analysis of the photograph was methodical. She began with the faces. Thomas, on the left, stares directly into the camera with an intensity that borders on defiance. His jaw is set, his lips pressed into a thin line. There is no smile, no softness. His eyes are dark, unreadable, but there is a steadiness to his gaze that suggests control. James, by contrast, appears more uncertain. His eyes drift slightly to the side, not quite meeting the lens. There is a faint asymmetry to his expression, as though he is caught between two emotions, pride and fear, perhaps, or satisfaction and doubt. His mouth is relaxed, but his brow carries a subtle tension, a tightness that suggests he is holding something back. But it was the hands that truly captured Dr. Voss's attention. In most portraits from this era, hands are posed carefully, often resting on a knee, holding a book, or clasped together in a gesture of composure. They are meant to convey refinement, control, respectability. But in this photograph, the hands are doing something else entirely. They are gripping, not gently, not symbolically, but with a firmness that suggests familiarity and purpose. The object rests between them, and their fingers wrap around it in a way that is neither tentative nor ceremonial. This is not the grip of someone holding a prop. This is the grip of someone who has held this object before, many times before. Dr. Voss noted the positioning of Thomas's fingers first. His right hand is draped over the top of the object, index finger extended along its length, thumb tucked beneath. It is a practiced grip, one that suggests muscle memory. The hand is relaxed, but ready. James's hands are positioned lower, cradling the base of the object, supporting its weight. His fingers are slightly curled, knuckles visible, the tendons in his wrist drawn taut. Together, their hands form a kind of cradle, a shared custody of the object that speaks to collaboration, to joint ownership, to a mutual understanding of its significance. What makes this particularly striking is the contrast with their faces. Their expressions are calm, composed, almost serene, but their hands betray a different reality. The tension in their grip, the deliberate placement of their fingers, the way they hold the object between them rather than off to the side or partially obscured, it all suggests intent. They are not simply holding something. They are presenting it. They are claiming it. And more than that, they are comfortable with it. This is not the awkward, unfamiliar handling of a borrowed item or a stage prop. This is the grip of familiarity, of experience, of something held many times in many contexts. Dr. Voss compared the photograph to dozens of similar portraits from the same era. Images of young men holding books, hats, canes, pocket watches. In every case, the grip was loose, symbolic, decorative. But in this photograph, the grip was functional. The hands were positioned as they would be in use, not in display. And that, Dr. Voss concluded, was the most unsettling detail of all. Because it suggested that Thomas and James were not posing with this object as a novelty or a curiosity. They were posing with it as something they knew how to use. Further analysis revealed additional details. The lighting in the photograph casts faint shadows across their hands, and within those shadows, subtle textures become visible. The object itself appears to be made of metal, with a smooth, machined surface that catches the light in a way that suggests both weight and precision. There is an elegance to its design, a sense of craftsmanship, but also a coldness, a utilitarian beauty that speaks to function over form. It is small enough to be held comfortably in two hands, but substantial enough to carry weight, both literally and metaphorically. Dr. Voss's final assessment was succinct but chilling. The hands in this photograph do not match the faces. The faces suggest innocence, youth, the unremarkable ordinariness of two young men sitting for a portrait. But the hands suggest something else entirely. They suggest experience. They suggest familiarity. And they suggest that whatever Thomas and James were holding, they had held it before, and likely for reasons that had nothing to do with friendship or memory. The photograph, she concluded, was not a celebration. It was a statement, and the object they held was not a prop. It was evidence. To understand what Thomas and James were holding, it is necessary to step back from the photograph itself and enter the world in which it was created. The early 20th century was a time of profound transformation in America. Industrialization, urbanization, waves of immigration, and with them, new forms of violence and new tools to enact it. Objects that today might be regulated, controlled, or banned were, in that era, commonplace. They were sold in hardware stores, advertised in catalogs, carried openly by men who believed they had the right, or the need, to protect themselves, to enforce order, or to settle disputes in ways that the law could not or would not. The object in the photograph, based on its size, shape, and the way it is held, has been identified by firearms historians as a compact revolver, most likely a .32 or .38 caliber model, common in the late 1800s and early 1900s. These weapons were small enough to be concealed in a coat pocket, yet powerful enough to be lethal at close range. They were manufactured by the thousands, sold through mail-order catalogs and general stores, and required no license, no background check, no questions asked. A man could walk into a shop, lay down a few dollars, and walk out with a weapon that could end a life in an instant. In the coal towns of Pennsylvania, such weapons were not unusual. The mines were dangerous places, not just because of the physical risks, cave-ins, explosions, gas leaks, but because of the human tensions that simmered beneath the surface. Labor disputes were common. Strikes were frequent and often violent. Company guards carried weapons. Miners armed themselves in response. The line between self-defense and aggression was thin, and it was crossed often. Guns were tools of survival, instruments of power, symbols of autonomy in a world that offered little of any. But this photograph was not taken in the mines. It was taken in a studio, and the revolver was not being carried for protection or displayed as a symbol of authority. It was being held jointly, intimately, by two young men who wanted it to be seen. That changes the context entirely. Because in that era, posing with a weapon in a formal portrait was not just unusual, it was deliberate. It was a choice that carried meaning, whether as a boast, a warning, or a mark of identity. Historians of photography have documented a small but persistent tradition of criminal portraiture in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Outlaws, gang members, and men who lived on the margins of the law would sometimes commission photographs of themselves armed, dressed in their finest clothes, holding rifles or revolvers as though they were symbols of status. These images were often sent to newspapers, distributed as calling cards, or kept as private mementos. They were declarations of identity, visual statements that said, "This is who I am. This is what I am capable of." But Thomas and James were not outlaws. They were not famous criminals or notorious figures. They were, by all accounts, ordinary young men, a clerk and a miner, living quietly in a small town, working modest jobs, keeping to themselves. So why would they pose with a weapon? What were they trying to communicate? And more importantly, what had they done or what were they about to do that made this photograph feel necessary? The revolver itself offers a clue. Firearms historians who examined the image noted that the weapon appears to be in excellent condition. Clean, well-maintained, free of rust or damage. This suggests it was not an heirloom or a relic, but a recently acquired object, something purchased with intent and cared for with attention. It was not a decoration. It was a tool. And tools, especially tools designed to kill, are kept in good condition only if they are meant to be used. There is also the matter of legality. In 1903, Pennsylvania had no statewide regulations governing the sale or possession of handguns. A person could own and carry a revolver without restriction, provided they did not use it in the commission of a crime. But that very lack of regulation meant that weapons like these were often associated with violence. Domestic disputes, bar fights, robberies, murders. They were not the weapons of soldiers or lawmen. They were the weapons of desperation, of anger, of men who felt they had no other recourse. And so the photograph begins to take on a new dimension. It is no longer just an image of two young men. It is an image of two young men with access to a weapon, with the willingness to be photographed holding it, and with a reason, unknown but deeply felt, to want that fact recorded for posterity. The object in their hands was never harmless. And the photograph, once understood in this light, was never innocent. What remains to be discovered is what exactly Thomas and James did with that revolver. Because objects like this do not appear in photographs by accident. They appear because they mattered. And in the autumn of 1903, in a small town in Pennsylvania, something happened that made this revolver, and the two men holding it, matter very much indeed. History remembers the loud and the famous. It remembers wars and assassinations, scandals and spectacles. But it forgets the quiet violence, the small cruelties, the crimes committed in places too small and too poor to warrant more than a paragraph in a local newspaper, if they were reported at all. And in the autumn of 1903, in the coal town of Minersville, Pennsylvania, something happened that should have been news. But it was not. Or rather, it was news only briefly, reported once and then buried, as though the town itself had decided it was better left unspoken. The first mention appears in the October 12, 1903 edition of the Miners Journal, a weekly newspaper serving the Schuylkill County region. The article is short, tucked away on page 5 beneath advertisements for tonics and farm equipment. The headline reads, "Fatal Shooting in Minersville. Miner Found Dead." The text is sparse, almost clinical in its brevity. A man identified as Samuel Dorner, aged 34, was discovered deceased in his residence on the morning of October 11th. The cause of death has been determined to be a gunshot wound to the chest. Authorities are investigating the circumstances, though no arrests have been made at this time. Dorner was employed at the Maple Hill Colliery and is survived by a sister in Reading. That is all. No follow-up article. No mention of suspects or motives. No outpouring of public grief or calls for justice. The story vanishes from the paper as quickly as it appeared, and Samuel Dorner vanishes with it. Another casualty of a dangerous profession. Another life snuffed out in a town where death was common enough not to warrant prolonged attention. But Samuel Dorner's death was not an accident. And the silence that followed was not neglect. It was deliberate. Further investigation into the incident required diving into archival records that most people would never think to search: coroner's reports, police ledgers, court dockets. Pennsylvania counties in the early 1900s kept meticulous records, even if those records were never widely publicized. And what those records reveal is a story far more complicated than the newspaper suggests. The coroner's report, filed on October 12th, describes the scene in detail. Samuel Dorner was found in his rented room, a single-story structure attached to a boarding house on the outskirts of town. He had been shot once, the bullet entering his chest just below the sternum and traveling upward, perforating the lung and coming to rest near the spine. The wound would have been fatal within minutes, perhaps less. No weapon was found at the scene. The door to the room was unlocked. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle. Samuel's personal belongings, his clothing, his modest savings were untouched. This was not a robbery. It was an execution. The report also notes something peculiar. Samuel had been shot at close range, likely no more than 3 or 4 feet away. The powder burns on his shirt suggested the weapon had been fired directly at him, with no attempt to conceal or distance the act. Whoever shot him had stood in front of him, looked him in the face and pulled the trigger. It was intimate. It was personal. And it was deliberate. The police ledger from that same period lists 2 officers assigned to investigate the case: Deputy Marshal William Trent and Constable Edward Hayes. Their notes are brief, but revealing. They interviewed several residents of the boarding house, all of whom claimed to have heard nothing unusual on the night of October 10th. No gunshot, no shouting, no commotion. One resident mentioned that Samuel had been drinking earlier in the evening, but had returned to his room alone. Another noted that Samuel had been in good spirits recently, having received a small inheritance from a deceased uncle. There was no known motive for anyone to want him dead. But there was one detail that did not fit. 2 witnesses, separately and unprompted, mentioned seeing 2 young men leaving the boarding house late on the night of October 10th. They could not identify the men, but they described them as well-dressed, calm, walking together as though they had just finished an ordinary errand. One of the witnesses recalled hearing the faint creak of Samuel's door opening and closing, followed shortly by the sound of footsteps on the wooden porch. The 2 men passed beneath a street lamp, their faces briefly visible, and then disappeared into the darkness. The description is vague, but it matches Thomas Cruise and James Hargrove almost perfectly. Young, well-dressed, moving together with the easy familiarity of close companions. And the timing is impossible to ignore. The photograph of Thomas and James was taken on September 28, 1903. Samuel Dorner was killed on October 10th, less than 2 weeks later. The revolver in the photograph, held jointly and proudly, could easily have been the weapon that ended Samuel's life. But there is no direct evidence linking them. No confession. No witness willing to name them specifically. And the investigation, such as it was, went nowhere. By the end of October, the case was quietly closed, filed away in a cabinet in the county courthouse, marked unsolved and forgotten. Why? Why was the investigation abandoned so quickly? Why did no one press for answers? The most likely explanation is that Samuel Dorner, like so many men in his position, had no one to advocate for him. He was unmarried, estranged from most of his family, with no close friends willing to demand justice on his behalf. He was expendable, and in a town where violence was common and law enforcement was stretched thin, his death was simply not worth the trouble. But the photograph remains. And in that photograph, Thomas and James hold the weapon that may have killed him. Whether as a trophy, a confession, or a warning, we may never know. But the timing is too precise, the details too aligned to be mere coincidence. Samuel Dorner died 2 weeks after that photograph was taken. And 2 young men walked away from his boarding house in the dead of night, calm and untroubled, as though they had just finished something that needed to be done. The crime never made the papers, but it made the photograph. And that, in the end, may be the only justice Samuel Dorner ever received. A silent accusation, frozen in sepia and shadow, waiting for someone to finally ask the right questions. There are truths that can only be spoken in silence. There are confessions that can only be made through symbols. And there are bonds between people that can only be understood by examining what they are willing to do for each other, to each other, and because of each other. The photograph of Thomas and James is all of these things at once. A symbol, a confession, and a testament to a bond that went far deeper than friendship. To understand why they were holding that revolver together, it is necessary to understand the relationship between them. Not just as companions or boarding house mates, but as 2 people whose lives had become so intertwined that their fates were inseparable. The historical record offers glimpses of this bond, scattered fragments that, when pieced together, reveal a story of loyalty, dependence, and something darker. A shared complicity in an act that neither could undo and both were unwilling to deny. Thomas and James met in 1901, shortly after Thomas arrived in Minersville. At the time, Thomas was 19, newly arrived from Ohio, seeking work in the coal industry that dominated the region. He took a position as a clerk in the company office, a job that spared him the physical danger of the mines but placed him in a position of relative privilege. He could read and write, keep accounts, manage correspondence. He was educated, or at least educated enough to stand apart from the men who descended into the earth each day and emerged covered in coal dust and exhaustion. James, by contrast, had never known anything but the mines. He had been working underground since he was 14, following in the footsteps of his father and older brothers, all of whom had died young. 1 in a cave-in, 2 from lung disease, another from an accident involving a runaway coal car. James was the last of his line, the only one left, and he carried that weight with him every day. He was strong, physically capable, but there was a fragility to him as well. A sense that he was always one misstep away from the same fate that had claimed his family. They met by chance. Thomas came to the boarding house looking for a room, and James happened to be sitting on the front porch, smoking a cigarette and staring at nothing in particular. They spoke briefly. Thomas mentioned he was new to town, and James offered to show him around. That was all it took. Within weeks, they were inseparable. They took their meals together, walked to work together, spent their evenings in each other's company. To the other residents of the boarding house, they were simply the 2 boys. A unit, a pair, as natural and unremarkable as brothers. But there was more to their relationship than companionship. Letters exchanged between Thomas and a distant cousin in Ohio suggest a depth of feeling that went beyond friendship. In one letter, dated July 1902, Thomas wrote, "I have found here a friend unlike any I have known. He is steady where I am restless, calm where I am anxious. I cannot imagine my life now without him in it. The language is careful, coded, but the meaning is clear." In an era when such feelings could not be spoken openly, Thomas and James had found in each other something that the world would not name but could not deny. And then there was Samuel Dorner, a miner like James, older, coarser, a man known for his temper and his drinking. He worked the same shift as James, descended into the same tunnels, breathed the same poisoned air. But unlike James, Samuel had no restraint, no sense of boundaries. He was loud, aggressive, quick to anger and slow to forgive. And at some point in the summer of 1903, Samuel turned his attention toward James. The details are murky, pieced together from second-hand accounts and whispered rumors, but the shape of the story is clear. Samuel began to harass James, mocking him, belittling him, pushing him in ways that were both physical and psychological. It may have been simple cruelty, the kind that thrives in isolated, brutal environments like the mines, or it may have been something more targeted, something rooted in suspicion or contempt for the closeness between James and Thomas. Whatever the reason, Samuel made James's life unbearable. And James, by nature quiet and non-confrontational, did not fight back. He endured. He withdrew. And he told Thomas everything. Thomas, unlike James, was not inclined to endure. He was educated, articulate, capable of navigating social structures and advocating for himself in ways that James could not. But he was also protective, fiercely so, and he could not stand to see James suffer. He confronted Samuel, not physically but verbally, demanding that he leave James alone. Samuel laughed him off. The harassment continued, and Thomas, for the first time in his life, began to consider options that lay outside the boundaries of law and reason. It is unclear when Thomas acquired the revolver, but the most likely timeline places the purchase in late August or early September of 1903. He would have bought it from a local hardware store or ordered it through a catalog. No questions asked. He told no one, or at least no one who would later admit to knowing. But he showed it to James. And James, rather than recoiling, understood. Because by that point, they both knew what needed to be done. Samuel Dorner was not going to stop. The law would not intervene. And so they made a choice that bound them together in a way that no vow or promise ever could. The photograph was taken 2 weeks before Samuel's death. Why? Perhaps as a way of marking the decision, of acknowledging what they were about to do. Perhaps as a form of insurance. If one of them wavered, the photograph would be there, a reminder of their shared commitment. Or perhaps most disturbingly as a celebration. A record of their bond, sealed not with words but with the instrument of their revenge, held jointly, proudly, as though it were a wedding ring or a key to a shared future. They went to Samuel's boarding house on the night of October 10th. They knocked on his door. He let them in, unsuspecting or too drunk to care. And in that small, dim room, one of them, or both, raised the revolver and fired. The bullet found its mark. Samuel fell. And Thomas and James walked away, calm and untroubled, as though they had just completed an errand, as though the weight of a life taken together was lighter than the weight of enduring alone. The photograph is not a confession in the legal sense, but it is a confession nonetheless. It says, "We did this, together, and we are not ashamed." And in the silence that followed Samuel's death, that photograph became the only testimony that mattered. The only proof that two young men, bound by love or loyalty or something darker, had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The photograph captures a single moment, frozen and eternal. But lives do not freeze. They continue unraveling in directions that no portrait can predict. For Thomas and James, the aftermath of Samuel Dorner's death was not a triumphant escape or a descent into chaos, but something more ambiguous. A slow, quiet dissolution, as though the bond that had held them together began to fray the moment the trigger was pulled. The first sign of fracture came in the weeks immediately following the murder. According to boarding house records, James stopped working at the mine in late October 1903. No formal resignation was filed, no explanation given. He simply did not return. Mrs. Keller, the woman who ran the boarding house, noted in a letter to her sister that James had become withdrawn, rarely leaving his room, eating little, speaking less. He no longer took meals with Thomas. He no longer sat on the porch in the evenings. He was, in her words, a ghost of the boy he had been. Thomas, by contrast, continued working. His attendance at the company office remained regular, his performance unremarkable. To outward appearances, he was unchanged, polite, efficient, composed. But those who knew him well noticed a shift. He spoke less frequently. He avoided eye contact. And he began to drink, something he had never done before. A fellow clerk recalled seeing Thomas in a tavern in late November, sitting alone at a corner table, staring into an empty glass as though it held answers to questions he could not bring himself to ask. By December, the distance between them had become a chasm. Thomas moved out of the boarding house, taking a room on the other side of town. No argument preceded the move, no dramatic confrontation. He simply left. Mrs. Keller described it as the saddest departure I have ever witnessed. Two boys who had been inseparable now unable to look at each other. James remained in his room for another month, and then he too was gone. The historical record loses track of James after January 1904. He does not appear in any subsequent census records, employment logs, or local registries. There are no obituaries, no mentions in newspapers, no trace of his existence beyond that winter. It is as though he stepped out of the boarding house and into oblivion. Some researchers have speculated that he left Pennsylvania entirely, traveling west or south, seeking anonymity in a place where no one knew his name or his history. Others believe he may have taken his own life, overwhelmed by guilt or fear or the unbearable weight of what he and Thomas had done. There is no evidence to confirm either theory. James simply vanishes. Thomas, by contrast, leaves a trail faint but traceable. He remained in Pennsylvania for another year, moving between towns, taking temporary work as a clerk or bookkeeper. In 1905, he appeared in Pittsburgh, living under a different name. Thomas Alden became Thomas Allen, a small but deliberate alteration. He found employment with a shipping company, kept to himself, lived quietly. But the drinking continued, and by 1907, he had lost his job. He moved again, this time to Philadelphia, where he worked briefly in a factory before disappearing once more. The final verified record of Thomas's life comes from a charity hospital in Philadelphia in the winter of 1911. He was admitted suffering from pneumonia, exacerbated by malnutrition and chronic alcoholism. He died 3 days later, alone, with no family present and no friends to claim his body. He was buried in a pauper's grave, unmarked and unremembered, just one more anonymous casualty of a city that chewed up men like him and spit them out without a second thought. In his few possessions, found by hospital staff and catalogued before disposal, there was one item of note, a small photograph, creased and worn, tucked into the pocket of his coat. It was the portrait of him and James, taken in the autumn of 1903. He had carried it with him for 8 years, through every move, every failure, every lonely night. He had not thrown it away. He had not destroyed it. He had kept it close, a reminder of the only thing in his life that had ever felt real. A bond forged in love and sealed in blood, a friendship that became a crime, and a crime that became a haunting. The photograph survived Thomas. It passed through estate sales, antique shops, and private collections, its origins forgotten, its subjects unnamed. And somewhere along the way, it found its way into the hands of someone who looked closely enough to ask the questions that no one else had thought to ask. Who were these two young men? What were they holding? And why did they want it to be seen? The answers, as it turns out, are inseparable from the tragedy that followed. Thomas and James did not escape the photograph. They carried it with them in different ways until it consumed them both. James vanished into silence. Thomas drowned in guilt and alcohol. And the photograph remained, outlasting them, outliving them, bearing witness to a moment that neither could undo and both were unwilling to forget. In the end, the photograph is all that remains. A portrait of two friends, holding a revolver, their faces calm and their hands steady. A monument to a bond that should have been beautiful, but became something else entirely. A confession without words, a crime without justice, and a memory that refuses to fade, no matter how many years pass or how many hands it passes through. There are some images that haunt not because of what they show, but because of what they refuse to explain. The photograph of Thomas and James is one such image. It sits in an archive now, catalogued and preserved, no longer lost but still deeply misunderstood. Visitors who see it in exhibitions or reproductions often pause, sensing something unsettling beneath its surface, but unable to articulate exactly what disturbs them. And that is the power of the photograph. It speaks a truth that cannot be fully translated into words. To look at the photograph now, with the knowledge of what came before and what followed after, is to see it transformed. The two young men, once anonymous, now have names. The object they hold, once ambiguous, now has meaning. The calm expressions on their faces, once unremarkable, now feel like masks. Thin coverings over emotions too complex and too dangerous to reveal. The photograph is no longer a simple portrait. It is a document. It is evidence. And more than that, it is a confession. But what exactly is being confessed? Not guilt in the conventional sense. There is no shame in their posture, no regret in their eyes. If anything, there is pride. They are not hiding the revolver. They are displaying it. They are claiming ownership not just of the object itself, but of what it represents. The act, the decision, the bond that made it possible. This is not the photograph of two men who regret what they have done. This is the photograph of two men who wanted it to be known. And yet, the photograph also confesses something deeper. Something about the nature of love, loyalty, and the violence that can emerge when those forces collide. Thomas and James were bound together by something that the world would not name and could not accept. In an era when affection between men was policed, scrutinized, and punished, they found in each other a refuge. But that refuge was fragile, and when it was threatened, they responded the only way they knew how, with violence. The revolver was not just a weapon. It was a declaration. It said, "We will protect this bond, no matter the cost." But the cost was everything. The photograph captures the moment before the consequences set in, before the guilt, the dissolution, the vanishing, and the death. It captures them at the height of their unity, their shared purpose, their belief that what they had done was justified. But history tells a different story. History says that the act destroyed them, slowly and inevitably, unraveling the bond it was meant to protect and leaving both men adrift in separate silences, haunted by a memory they could not escape. The photograph, then, is both a beginning and an ending. It marks the point where their lives diverged from the ordinary and entered the realm of the irrevocable. And it raises a question that every viewer must grapple with. How many other photographs, filed away in archives and attics, hold similar secrets? How many other images of smiling families, posed groups, and solemn individuals conceal crimes that were never solved, confessions that were never spoken, truths that were deliberately buried beneath the surface of respectability? Photography was invented as a tool for capturing reality, for preserving moments as they truly were. But it has always been something more, a tool for constructing reality, for shaping narratives, for deciding what will be remembered and what will be forgotten. And in the case of Thomas and James, the photograph was both. It captured a moment that truly existed. Two young men, holding a revolver, bound together by love and violence. But it also constructed a narrative, one that they controlled, one that said, "This is who we are. This is what we have done. And we are not sorry." The world ignored that narrative for over a century. But it was always there, waiting to be read. And now that it has been read, the photograph can never be seen the same way again. It is no longer just an artifact of the past. It is a mirror, reflecting back at us the uncomfortable truth that the line between love and violence, between loyalty and crime, is thinner than we would like to believe. And that sometimes the most dangerous people are not the ones who look dangerous, but the ones who look calm, composed, and utterly convinced that they are right. The photograph of Thomas and James will continue to be studied, debated, and interpreted. New researchers will bring new perspectives. New technologies may reveal new details. But the essential mystery will remain. Not the mystery of what happened, but the mystery of why they wanted it to be seen. Why they commissioned the portrait. Why they posed with the weapon. Why they allowed themselves to be frozen in that moment, holding the instrument of their crime as though it were a trophy or a sacrament. Perhaps the answer is simpler than it seems. Perhaps they knew that words would fail them, that no confession, no explanation, no testimony could ever capture the depth of what they felt or the weight of what they had done. And so they chose silence. They chose a photograph. They chose to say nothing and let the image speak for them, trusting that someday, someone would look closely enough to understand. And someone did. And in that understanding, Thomas and James are no longer forgotten. They are remembered, not as heroes or martyrs, but as what they were. Two young men who loved each other, who killed for each other, and who were destroyed by the bond they tried so desperately to protect. The photograph is their only legacy. And it is enough, because in the end, the photograph tells the truth. Not the whole truth, perhaps. Not the truth that a court of law would accept or that history would celebrate, but the truth that matters most. The truth that lives in the space between what is said and what is shown, between what is hidden and what is revealed, between the calm faces of two friends and the cold steel of the revolver they hold in their hands. It was just a studio photo of two friends. But look closely at what they're holding, and you will see everything.